Hey guys, it's Jeremy Maestas from the NRCS here, and in this module, we're going to be talking about planning for low-tech restoration projects. And this is actually the structure we're going to follow for the next few modules. And what we're going to be working through is a conservation planning process that contains three phases that we'll generically call the planning phase, the one we'll talk about here in Module 3. Next, the design phase we'll cover in Module 4. And then finally, implementation phase in Module 5. But for this first section on the planning phase, you can refer to Chapter 3 in your design manual. Before I hop into the architecture of the conservation planning process that we'll be following, I want to talk for a minute first about spatial scale of planning. Of course, this is happening at multiple scales, right? We're all focused primarily at the project scale and doing things on the ground, but that local action is also embedded in a larger geographical context. And we're not going to be covering a lot of the larger scale planning that occurs at whole regions or watersheds or even a network of drainages. We're going to be focused primarily at this project scale, at the riverscape or reach scale, even down to the structure level to some extent. We'll talk about that. But I wanted you to be aware that this is all very important to local success. So some of the things that even if you're not doing the broader scale management and a goal setting at that level, it's good to be aware of those plans in your watershed that can help you identify what some of the regional goals and targets are. For example, if you're working towards, recovery of a imperiled fish species, understanding what the conditions are at these larger scales, the limiting factors, and what you might be able to contribute to some overall goals are really important. And of course, that also provides context, context in terms of what's going on at these larger scales that can help you be more successful if you're aware of them and can tie in appropriately. So just wanted you to be aware of that. It is something that's very important, but it's just not going to be covered in this course. All right, here's the conservation planning process that we're going to be following. And this is actually borrowed from the NRCS. The NRCS conservation planning process guides all the actions that we do at NRCS in our planning with landowners in terms of conservation and restoration on a wide variety of resource issues. But we've poached it and modified it a bit for our purposes here in low-tech restoration because it's generally the process that most agencies and organizations follow anyways, even if you don't have a name for it or haven't thought through it. It's just a very logical process that we do implement on most restoration projects. And it's been organized into three buckets or three phases. Phase one is really that collection and analysis phase where we're trying to understand what the problems are and what some opportunities are, doing some resource inventory, discussing with the landowner and manager what some of the objectives and opportunities are on that land. And then we'll move into phase two once we've decided, here there is an issue and we'd like to address it using low tech. Phase two is really about kind of that design phase or coming up with some alternatives, laying some things out, and then making some decisions on what we're going to implement to reach some of those goals and objectives that we set in phase one. And then finally in phase three, we get to roll up our sleeves and have some fun and implement the project. And so this is really the application and also the evaluation. So if we're doing some follow-up monitoring of those results, that's part of informing our adaptive management. And of course, this isn't a linear process, so you can go back and forth between these phases at any time. And even if it's not explicit in this diagram, this idea of adaptive management really is baked into our mindset throughout, that we're constantly trying to learn as we go and implement this work. So we're going to co-opt this conservation planning process from NRCS and use that in terms of our instruction for the next several modules. And we've taken that concept and added some specific elements related to low tech that will help you work through the process and address key questions, which are the green boxes, and then also make some key decisions. The yellow areas help you decide, do we continue or not with this type of approach based on the information we're getting. So you don't have to worry about the ugliness of the diagram at this point. Simply to say that we've added some components along the way that'll help you work through this process. All right, in phase 1 of the planning process, which we will cover here in this module, what we're really focused on is identifying what are those broad management goals, what are the riverscape conditions, and what's the recovery potential. How much of the valley bottom is available for restoration given certain constraints or risks that are present in that area. And we may decide as we go through this process that, low tech isn't appropriate for a variety of reasons, but during this phase we're sorting through some of that. And so encourage you to continue watching the rest of the videos to learn more about phase 1, the planning process.